We're very lucky today to have Simon Agass, who's the head of Geospatial Systems
and Solutions.
Very important. Satellite Applications Catapult. I was just learning a little bit about the catapults, of which apparently there are 11 in the UK, which were set up maybe 5 years ago to bridge the gap between research, R&D and the commercial world. Really drive the take-up of emerging technologies and drive the UK economy. And the Satellite Applications Catapult is unsurprisingly a catapult for the application of satellite technology. So satellite technology, it is one of these things where I think 5 years ago, totally bonkers. What kind of practical application can it have in an SME dealing with metals? I think as time has gone on, it's probably got slightly less bonkers, and in the last year or two, we've seen some really interesting applications come out in the news. Not a lot in oil and gas, a little bit in the fringes of metals. Very much, Simon. I want to leave you to talk about it. I was going to say we're an old company. We were founded in 1929. Some of our businesses are much older than that, and the purpose of these AMC talks is to make sure that we're around in 100 years' time, and the sole responsibility for that hangs on you today.
Perfect.
Here.
No pressure.
No pressure. But it's not even about the future. I mean, these are areas where we can look a little bit into the future, but we are seeing some of these applications come into the present, come into competitors in the present. So I'm looking forward a lot to hearing what you have to say, and I'll hand over.
Thank you very much.
To Simon.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here today. It's a real honour to be able to come down here and talk to you about this. This presentation is called Decision Without Borders, and the reason for that being is that satellites, they don't have to respect geographical or political boundaries. They have the ability to take satellite images anywhere in the world. And with the latest constellations of satellites that are coming online, we're able to take high resolution pictures on almost a daily basis of any point on the planet. So these have many applications. Today I'm going to touch on a few of those, I would welcome any questions that you have during the presentation. I like an interactive session. You probably don't want to listen to my voice constantly. I'll kind of move on through the presentation. So this is the first picture I'm going to show, and I showed this picture first when I did a talk last year on satellites for the financial markets, and I put this picture up because this was Hurricane Irma. And this just kind of represents some of the power that satellite imageries can bring in terms of, I think, you see a satellite image like this in some of the financial markets, and there's probably a large gasp as something like this is heading towards the grain belt of America. But really, kind of, what is Earth observation? Today I'm going to go through a bit of a 101 as to what it is, what it can do, and how it works. We'll see this. So Earth observation is about gathering information on the Earth's physical, chemical and biological processes and systems. So this is a radar image of actually some ice sheets, and seeing them and how they move, and the different colours kind of represent how it gets stretched over time. But there are so many different applications that we can use satellites for, and this is just a real snapshot of them. As I said, I'll go through this presentation. I'll talk a little bit about actually how it works and the things that you can actually see, and how they're applicable. So I'm going to start though with
We live in a satellite-enabled age. You may not be able to see the spacecraft flying above us, but they are the very life support system that we all depend on every day. Earth observation satellites give us a unique vantage point. We can see the health of crops, the height of the sea, even the pattern of the winds. This helps us protect the environment and manage resources. Satellites enable long-term sustainable development and also play a key role in helping us respond to global humanitarian disasters. Communication satellites keep us connected, giving us data on the go anywhere in the world. They're powering a revolution in how we see and share information, helping us to do business, create new networks, and even stay healthy. global positioning satellites have fundamentally changed the way we navigate and coordinate. There are now thousands of products and services, even entire industries, all relying on accurate location and timing information from space. At the same time, it's getting cheaper to access. A new generation of smaller satellites is going into orbit, packing powerful technology. The cost of launches is coming down. The Internet of Space is coming, a network of connected satellites spanning the Earth. All of this opens up incredible opportunities for business, governments, communities, all of us. This is the new space age, and we're all part of it.
So that's just a little video from the Catapult about a very quick overview of kind of where the power of satellites are. But actually, I'll press play on this. But really, we also need to understand how the satellites work. If anyone's seen CSI, or if anyone's seen Enemy of the State, it's not like that. We can't point satellites at the touch of a button as to where we would like them to be. So there's about 400 different Earth observation satellites in orbit at the minute.
But having said that, they do have resolutions down to that size, though, don't they? Satellites. They can. I know they can't maybe track people like those movies, but
yeah. Well,
how small is the resolution?
How small is the resolution? I'll touch on that in a second. Okay. I've got a couple of slides with a really good kind of example as to how that works. But
there's no shot of us in.
No, there's no shot of us, and you can't read a newspaper from space.
Yeah, more my day off the other day.
So satellites, we have what we call kind of like duty cycles and operational orbits. Satellites pass over. A satellite is generally operational for only about 10 minutes of a 90-minute orbit. And that's due to its kind of power and computing constraints. Essentially, these things are computers in space. We have to have solar panels to power them, and so they can only actually be active for a certain amount of time during an orbit.
Do they not have a network of geostationary satellites though that are far enough away that they can pinpoint anywhere?
There is a network of geostationary satellites, but because they have to be about 33,000 kilometres away, the resolution, you tend to get kind of full disk images, so you can't actually get down to the kind of the precision that you need. And they're great for weather satellites when you need to track kind of weather patterns, but when you're actually looking at kind of taking images of something quite specific, then you need something that's in a lower Earth orbit. There's about 400 different satellites up in space, and they range for a whole variety of different types. But when we talk about kind of Earth observing satellites, there are generally two types of Earth observing satellites. They have a passive system. Essentially, they're like cameras in space. So they require a reflection of the sun's light off the Earth, and then they create it just in the same way that a mobile phone camera or your digital camera will just kind of collect the image. And with that, you get this sort of image. So this is a 50 centimeter image, and this is Harwell. So this is where my office is. So office is there, and this is the what we call the diamond light source. So this is part of the laboratory that's the.
Is that in Oxfordshire?
That's in Oxfordshire, yeah. So the Harwell, yeah. So the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory, and that's kind of the mini particle accelerator that's there. So that gives you an example of what you can see with a 50 centimeter resolution image. Now, 50 centimeter is not the highest resolution satellite you can get. And actually, this is a good example of the different resolutions. So this is 50 centimeter, that's 5 meter, and that's 10 meter. So you can see the different kind of levels of detail that you get. There are now satellites that we can get down to, or commercial satellites we get down to about 32 centimeter resolution data. 50 centimeters is a good balance, because if you've got basically the higher resolution, the more data you have, and actually they can become a little bit unwieldy and unmanageable just because of the size of the data that you need to deal with. And generally also how it works is the higher resolution, actually the smaller area that you're looking at on the ground, and the lower resolution, the bigger area. So something like this, you're probably looking at what we call we measure a satellite image by the width, not by the length of it. So the swath width is probably something about, it could be about 50 kilometres for that one, whereas if it's something like 10 metres, you can be talking a couple of hundred kilometres. So it's all kind of relative as to what it is you want to look at. If you're looking at something on a continental scale, or if you want to look at sand dunes in a desert, then actually you don't need a high resolution satellite. You need a medium resolution satellite, because then you can look at the whole desert. Whereas if you want to look at a building or cars or something like that, then actually you don't need a huge image, but you do need a higher resolution. And they collect in all different bands of light. So this is a very beautiful image. This is it's a volcano in Guatemala. It's not the one that exploded last week, but it is a volcano in Guatemala. But you do get some very, very beautiful images coming through. So the other type of sensor that we have up there is what's called an active sensor, an active system. So and that's basically like a radar in space. And we call it a synthetic aperture radar, because the only way we can get a high resolution with synthetic aperture radar is by having a huge antenna. So we call it synthetic because actually it just uses the relative motion of the satellite passing through space. So it sends down a signal and then it picks it up as it's a bit further on its orbit. And that's how we get a quite high resolution image with this. Now, the benefits with active systems are you don't have to worry about cloud. So you can get a nice image, and in a country like the UK, it's really beneficial if you don't have to worry about cloud. The only challenge that you have is you don't get as pretty an image, because it's not actually recording the reflected light, it's recording a reflected signal. And so again, this is pretty much the same image but from a different angle. So there's our office, there's the diamond light source. And you're getting a different type of data back. You're getting a physical measurement of the signal that's sent down. And you can record different things. So they're very good for if you need to understand kind of subtle changes in height.
Just in terms of what's happened in that picture, these trees have shadows.
They do, yes.
How does that work from a radar?
Because the radar signal is interacting with the tree. And therefore it's still creating that kind of shadow. So these images kind of they look a bit backwards because the signal is coming down from one area and you're picking it up from a different part of the orbit. So that's how you're kind of ending up with this shadow, because the shadow, you're still getting that shadow effect because the signal isn't passing through the tree. And they're very good for doing things like ground movement. So if there's any subsidence or actually I haven't got it in this presentation, but there was some work being done on the Crossrail project where they're taking satellite images using radar over London, and you can actually see where the Crossrail project is just because you're getting slight subsidence in the ground. You kind of see this red track that's being identified. So they're different satellite systems, and they're there for different purposes, and they're kind of equally good at what they do. So how does a satellite see? So it's all about actually the different spectrums of light, and most satellite systems, they won't just collect in red, green, blue like a normal camera. Will have a far greater range of spectra, and then we can use those different bands of light to kind of create different information products. So this is what we call the true color image. So that's actually what that is like. That's using red, green, blue. In this one we call it a false color image. So we're actually using near infrared, red and green. And what that does is that highlights all of the vegetation because of the way that the vegetation reflects near infrared light. This again is kind of our radar image, and that's our thermal bands. So we can use that information in lots of different ways to kind of give us indications of different things, and that's how kind of we build our different applications around those. So a little bit about the applications market. So we saw in the little video earlier that, you know, with the kind of there's a bit of a revolution going on in space, and this is, we kind of call it the new space age. So whereas traditionally satellites or Earth observation satellites have been very big, very cumbersome. So I think the first Earth observing satellite was Landsat, which was launched in 1972, and you know they were very big satellites, and because there was only a couple of them, you could only get an image whenever it was taking an image over your particular area. So it was very difficult to build kind of services off the back of that and kind of commercial applications. But that is all changing now. And the size of spacecraft is coming down massively, and I think even this slide's a little bit out of date because it says 3 kilograms, and actually we've got satellites now that are this big that we put up in space for doing different applications, and and we'll see we'll see some of those slightly later on, but it does mean that with the reduction of cost to getting these assets up into orbit, we can put far more of them up there, and also the access to building them. So whereas previously companies like Airbus would be building a satellite and it would be a $500 million satellite that gets stuck on a rocket and put up in space, that's now completely changing. And so actually these guys here, this was 2010. This is a company called Planet Labs, started in that chap's garage. So this is this is where they started, and they now have the largest constellation of satellites ever built. So they've got about 300 satellites up in space, and they're all about that big, and they take very nice images. And they were originally, when they sent them up, they were being launched out the back of the International Space Station. Quite literally, they had a cartridge mechanism that just fired them off as the space station went around orbit. And
would they receive orders then from various companies about what they would like their particular satellites to do?
Yeah, so originally when they started, the satellites weren't particularly controllable, so they kind of got images of pretty much what they were taking images of, and they are shoebox sized images, and you get a 5-meter resolution. So actually the resolution wasn't bad for the size of camera that you're talking about, and they're in a very low Earth orbit. But because they're not $500 million satellites, they're about £20,000 for something like that, and they build a couple of hundred of them and they stick them up. They have a very fast turnover in terms of technology development, because these little satellites, they only last about 18 months in space and then just burn up in the atmosphere. So they can replenish them, which means they can have a far quicker turnaround in terms of the technology that they're creating. When they started building these things, they were literally building them with mobile phones and big lenses and Arduino boards and Raspberry Pis and things like that. And if they didn't work, that's all right, they just built something slightly more robust and sent it up a couple of months later.
So what would it cost to put up a basic?
So it's always the cost of the launch which is the expensive bit, actually, not necessarily the development of the satellite. So this is why these guys, they were building, they'd build like 50 at a time. They'd put them in one of these cartridge mechanisms, and they'd kind of pack them around other things that were in the rocket, and so they're kind of piggybacking on other launches so they could try and get them as low cost as possible. But I think the first. They tend to launch a set of satellites, and they're probably talking £1 or £2 million to do that, and that's including building them. And so they'd kind of go. These guys are from California, so probably getting Silicon Valley money to build these different systems and stick them up in space and see what happens. But it's really caused a huge revolution in kind of the industry, and actually it's kind of really been disruptive in the industry, because all of a sudden these companies who are who rely on big defence contracts and big government subsidies to build these $500 million satellites will go, actually, they're not much worse than we are. And it kind of goes the 80-20 rule in terms of, because this data is a lot cheaper, people are actually working around some of its limitations, thinking, well, actually, how can we just cope with its limitations? Because it might not be quite as accurate, or it might not be quite as high resolution, or its positioning might be slightly off, but actually there's an awful lot of corrections you can do kind of post that, and so people are kind of working out how to make do with that, because actually the cost is an awful lot lower. So the cost of a normal kind of optical satellite image, so you get one image, if you got one image of a good example is, I was taking some pictures over Milton Keynes, and it's about 340 square kilometres, and you get one image, and it costs about £10,000 to get one image. So you kind of have to be able to get that value back out of doing that. So, but these guys are then they're coming up with new and different disruptive models. They're saying, oh, well, just pay us a subscription of £700 a year, and then you can just access our data as we get it. You might not be able to target the data, and in other words, task it and say, I want that place. But they're taking images of pretty much everywhere on the planet every day. So you can kind of work around those limitations and say, well, all right, I might not have an image tomorrow, but I'll have it the next day. And you kind of work out how to build a service on the back of that. So it's really kind of changed the market and really disruptive. And now there's a whole load of different companies that are doing the same thing, and some in the UK. So we've got a company up in the north in Clyde Space. They're building these kind of CubeSats, and actually Airbus bought out a company called Surrey Satellites, and so they're now started. Surrey Satellites were building kind of medium-sized satellites that were about that big, and now they're moving into these very small, different models. So you can have that kind of competitive market. So it's really helping kind of drive down the price and driving innovation, because now you don't have to be a large company with big budgets to use satellite imagery. You can be guys in a garage thinking of what you can do with these images. So, and this is kind of creating this this whole revolution in the market, and we like to say that it's data is a natural resource, or it's certainly becoming a resource, and you'll probably hear people in the market talk about data is the new oil, because if you've got data, you can do stuff with it, you can add value to it, or you can derive value from it. And we're now being flooded with satellite data, so there's a whole raft of different things that we can do. In 2014, the European Space Agency launched a new set of satellites called Sentinels, and as part of it was funded by the European Commission, and it was their kind of Copernicus program. And that's also kind of helping revolutionise the market in terms of their medium resolution satellites. You're talking about 10 meters, but it's free data, so anybody can use it. And and that again, it's kind of generating a huge volume of data. It's very regular, it's very reliable. It's not every day, but you can get pretty much most places on the planet, certainly every week and a half. So and it's free data. So it's kind of driving that revolution in terms of how people have got all this data they can do stuff with, and they can start building business models off the back of it and creating services. So it's really interesting stuff, and so we're getting about 13 petabytes of raw data, or we will get 13 petabytes of raw data by between 2015 and 2030. So yeah, it's a lot of data, and obviously now to think of new and creative ways of actually how we manage that. So there we go. Data is like oil. So it's interesting when it's refined. And I should probably say, in the audience, it's probably actually interesting when it's usable, or when it's probably it's valuable when it's refined. So and now it's kind of creating these different services, these different applications, because we now need to move into this. It's an information age. It's people don't want data; they want lots of knowledge out of it. That's the valuable bit. So there's kind of these different knowledge services coming on. So, and we can talk about some of those. But also, there's a huge amount of data out there. Actually, how do we connect it? Like we said, traditionally, Earth observation data. It's been the preserve of research and technology institutions and space agencies, and I think there's a great statistic out there that 80% of all Earth observation data has never been looked at. It just sits on servers in research organisations, and sometimes it's in an exotic format. It's too big to process. So there's all this data out there, and actually we need to see how we can connect it to actually what's going on in the real world. And we've got this. The web of data is out there now, and we've got connected data. But it's how do we get that Earth observation data and actually connect it to the real world. So this is a project I worked on in Chile, and this was essentially to do that. It was how do we connect Earth observation data so it's actually make it usable to people who are non-experts, because there's two ways we can make the data more usable. We can either make everybody an Earth observation expert, or we can actually just make the data easier to use, and the latter is, I think, probably the best way of doing it. So with this particular project, we took a catalogue of data, and using some different web technologies, like using linked data standards, we were able to kind of classify what's going on in that image, by just using lots of different geospatial data sets that are out there on the web. And so we can connect all these things up. So rather than getting an image and having to process it and having to understand it and kind of put it in the context that you're seeing, well, actually what can we just draw upon that's already out there on the web? So this catalogue would it would take an image, it would create it would go out to search on the web for other things that were going on. So this particular time we were looking at an earthquake that happened in Decato in Chile, and then so the system would go out there and it would look for all of the different publications that are also available on the web, and just kind of connect all those things up. And so a user could come on, they could pick a satellite image, or you could search for a satellite image and just say, okay, well, show me all the satellite images that have volcanoes in them with a population centre of greater than 30,000 within 10 kilometres of the summit. And so then it would just retrieve all of that using different geospatial data sets. And you know, we're now moving into the world of machine learning. So we really want to make satellite data more accessible and more usable. So can we start bringing in other technologies? So we're using this kind of machine learning, AI techniques, so that we can actually start to do kind of trend analysis, we can start to do predictions, we can start to extract different features from that and just provide those information products as seamlessly as possible to the end user. So this is a whole load of different of work that we're that we're looking at, and so we're touching here on kind of crop yield. So so this is something that we were looking at to be able to forecast different crop yields in some different states in America, and kind of looking at kind of the wheat crop. So we use Earth observation data to look at kind of the different growth stages over the year. So then the next year we can look at a particular point in time and say, well, actually, how does it compare, and what would be the yield be given that it's at this stage of growth at this particular time of the year. And so we can start to provide those informations then to the financial sector and to, you know.
Can you have a satellite, using this example of the crops, so you send up a satellite and it's owned by Cargill, let's say, and they send that satellite up specifically just to look at crops in America, and that's its sole job. It doesn't take images or anything else, it just scans all the fields in.
I think certainly we're moving to an age where that's possible.
They could literally be totally specific of what they want to do,
yeah.
to look at.
Yeah, I mean, I think currently the way that satellites work, and because they kind of have this duty cycle, they have this kind of prioritization of orbit and to where they take different images, that the different companies, they will always try and maximize the value you can get out of an orbit, and actually sometimes it goes to almost the highest bidder. And quite often, certainly with some of the companies where their major contracts are defence, then if something is going on in some part of the world, it's very difficult to get time on the satellites, to actually kind of buy time on the satellites. But I think we're now moving to an era where actually companies will just own their own satellites to look at something specific.
So you can you actually steer them?
Yes, yeah. So they are steerable. They're steerable to a certain extent, so you can tell it what to look at. But it still has to do its orbit. You can't make it move. So you kind of, in a certain way, you have to kind of wait. So you can create an orbit where it has a priority over a certain area. So the Sentinel satellites, for example, because they're funded by the European Commission, the way that the orbit is set up, they pass over Europe, and they more than they do any other place in the world, if you like, just because of the way that the orbit is kind of calculated.
Sorry, on one orbit track though, what's your width of viewing? Because obviously you're not going to be able to move the satellite, right? You can move the left.
Yes, you can move that. You can point it left or right, kind of thing.
What's your width of the track that you can actually look at?
It depends on the resolution of the satellite.
Say you're using your half-metre resolution.
If you're using the half-metre resolution, you're probably looking at a track width of probably a maximum of about 150 kilometres.
Okay, so you're still going to need hundreds of them to cover. Let's say you wanted to do crop yields in America, you're going to need,
but there's different ways of doing it there. So if you're doing something as specific as kind of crop yield, and you want to know kind of, well, where is it in the particular growth stage, then then yes, you're probably going to need lots of images and lots of processing. But there are other ways of doing it. So you could use a lower resolution satellite and actually look at the health of the crops. So you use something what we call NDVI, which is Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which gives you kind of a score as to how healthy the crop is. But you could just look at continental America then, and you'd be looking at it would be very low resolution, so it'd be quite granular in terms of the information you get, but then you could use that to target higher resolution assets to go, okay, well, that area isn't quite as healthy, can we have a look and see what's going on there? Or that area looks quite healthy, so we won't worry about that for the time being. And so that's kind of the way that we use these systems. We use the lower resolution ones to target where we're going to use the higher resolution ones.
Very interesting.
So with all of this, and like we've been saying, actually kind of it's the consumerization now of all this technology. It's now becoming that stage where it's no longer the preserve of large, big industry or science or research. We can now actually start putting this technology in the hands of companies who really want to use it and use it as a regular service and a regular application. So a little bit about the Catapult and kind of what we do. The space sector when we started in 5 years ago was about 7% of the global space economy is kind of what it was estimated at. And we have a target that we've been given by the UK government by 2030 we should be 10% of that market. And so we want to have about a 40 billion share in that market globally. And so that's what we're there to do. We are a not-for-profit RTO. We're part funded by the government, so the government contribution is about 10%. Oh, not 10%. Is about 10 million a year, and that's about a third of our income. And that's there really to keep us honest, if you like. So we're there to grow the industry. We're not there to compete with the industry. So we spend a lot of time talking to businesses, SMEs, and actually helping them grow. So we're not just all about the technology. We've got business specialists, we've got designers, we've got an in-house entrepreneur who actually supports different businesses, so we're really there to kind of help grow that market. And we do that through technology development, we do that through different projects, we do that through kind of these demonstrators that we build demonstrators for markets where they're either using satellite data and don't know they're using it, or there's a potential for them to benefit from using satellite data. So we can kind of we can get funding to kind of build these demonstrator projects to show the value of the market and the value of the systems, and also facilities. So we've got our office in Harwell, and so we've got a whole load of different facilities there that companies can come and use. We've got what we call an antenna farm on the roof, so we've got 40 commercially available communications antenna on the roof. We've got test ranges, we've got visualization suites, we've got our own cloud computing facility, it's there really is there for people to come and try and come and use, we've also got our own flight operations centre. So we ran the first 6 weeks of Tech DemoSat. We've done the Mars rover trials when they had the European Space Agency Mars rover over in Nevada. We did all the operations, the trial operations from there. And when Tim Peake went up to the Space International Space Station, we did all the live video broadcast as it was passing over the UK, so we used our antenna to do all that. We are kind of set up to try and be a bit of everything in the space sector and really kind of try and support its growth. But one of the very important things that we do is we have different market programs. So we've got intelligent transport, blue economy, sustainable living and government services. So those are kind of our different market areas that we kind of target. So we've got funding that we use to create these different demonstrators and kind of show value in those areas. So we talk about the blue economy. Blue economy, we're talking about kind of shipping, we're talking about illegal fishing, we're talking about logistics, we're talking about what we call cross-beach logistics. So how do we manage, and how can space technologies really kind of support those industries. So we've been doing a lot of work around illegal fishing. So this is one of the programs that we've developed to track fishing fleets globally. And so what you're seeing here is all of the ship's tracks globally. So there isn't, believe it or not, there isn't actually an outline of any countries. It's just where we've got all the different shipping tracks. It's around the coasts, and so we look at different technologies for doing this. So these are all being monitored by satellite. So all ships have what we call an AIS beacon on them, and it's supposed to be an anti-collision radio signal that they just kind of send out that says what their position is. It's supposed to be kind of within the horizon, but we can pick that up from satellite. So because there isn't a horizon if you're going straight up, so we can record all those signals, and we can start to put behavioural analytics on the vessels, so we can understand what we think they might be doing. So for example, if we've got a vessel that is saying it's a cruise ship, in inverted commas, but then doing very short tracks up and down a sea mountain somewhere they shouldn't be, then we know it's probably doing some illegal fishing and doing things it shouldn't be doing. Also, we can pick up things like, aircraft carriers have a tendency not to say they're an aircraft carrier, they will be a cruise ship as well. So there's a lot more cruise ships out there than there actually are. And so, you know, it's a huge global opportunity in terms of, and this is being funded by the Pew Charitable Trust. So they're a big trust in oil money. I think it came from the Pew Charitable Trust, and so they support this. It's their kind of goal to end illegal fishing globally, and so we worked with them to develop this system. And we're trying to use some novel techniques as well. So to kind of do all this mapping and to do a lot of the some of the analytics, we actually use games designers and games engines. So we can kind of use some different technologies that the market hasn't really used before to kind of try and build these different systems. So we can start to, because it's all automated, we can start to flag ships that are saying they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And in areas they shouldn't be doing. So also this is another application. So this was a energy company that came to us with a particular challenge. We were trying to understand how satellites could support different companies, and this is a nuclear power station somewhere in the northwest of England, and the problem they had was they had to do a emergency shutdown of a nuclear power station because they had 40 tons of jellyfish that went into the cooling intake, and which represented a bit of a challenge for them. And they came to us and said, well, is there anything you can do about, we were actually talking about other things at the time, and we were trying to just kind of get some requirements, and they said, well, you're not going to be able to do anything about jellyfish. And we said, well, we don't know, let's have a look. When was the actual incident? So we had a look, and because of the way that this is a huge swarm of jellyfish that were breaking the surface of the water, so we were able to identify it, it's going to be something that's very difficult to actually put into a service without having a satellite that's always looking at a nuclear power station. But it was just it demonstrated actually what the art of the possible is. Actually, we can see these things from space, and we can actually build processes that identify these different things. And they were very keen to do it, because if they had have known about it, they'd have known how to do a controlled shutdown, which is a lot cheaper than the £1.5 million a day it cost them to do an emergency shutdown.
Is that Wilbur? North Wales?
No, it's not. No.
I was going to say the water looks a bit blue for that.
Yeah, slightly further north. So that's just an example of actually trying to just innovate around a particular problem and try and find a solution for it. Now, moving on to sustainable living. Again, we look at the different markets that are within this, and actually how can satellites support these different things. So agriculture applications. So when I spoke a little bit before about actually being able to tell the health of crops. So when farmers are spending, sorry, it's a bit jumpy, when farmers are spending an awful lot of their money on actually where they put fertilisers, where they water their crops, because they're having to do basically a blanket distribution across their fields. Actually, if they can be told, actually this bit of your field is the bit that isn't healthy, and the rest of it's fine, or these are the bits that are suffering from water stress, then they can actually start to target that. And whereas on an individual farm basis it might not make a huge amount of difference, actually when you start looking at the big kind of commercial farming, then you can make a huge amount of difference, huge amount of saving as to the different things that they're using. So I've been looking at different ways, and an awful lot of these tractors these days they're autonomous. You pretty much press go and they kind of go. So we've been looking at how we can get satellite feeds into in-cab systems, and kind of create different plans for the way they distribute across fields, and also kind of putting in different IoT sensors to look at different stressing. Given the country that we live in, we've been looking at different radar applications for this, because actually just trying to take a satellite image of a field in the UK, you might get one image a year that doesn't have a cloud in it. So when we can start to look at using radar data, this is looking at the different growth stages throughout the year, and where concern could be, or where you might want to kind of show some attention to a particular field, so you can start to see in bits of red where actually you might want to go and do something as a farmer. So those are just some of the applications that we've been working on for that. And this is using high resolution optical data, and again it's just kind of, we're looking at different stresses on the crops, and actually how we can start to target where a farmer may want to pay particular attention. Deforestation assessment, so this is Bolivia in the 1990s, and that's it in 2010. So these are kind of looking at kind of countrywide problems and challenges as well, and how we can support those. So these are kind of applications that they're more on kind of government basis. So geological surveying and monitoring. So this is probably something that might be quite interesting. So this is normal satellite image of a particular mine in Chile, and then actually what we've done is we've done using shortwave infrared, we can actually start to look at the surface geology of the mine, and again, so we can kind of support where you might want to target things, where you might want to look at different areas for extraction.
So what's that picture on the right showing?
So the picture on the right it's showing the different characteristics of the surface rock, really. So it's we use kind of spectral analysis to pick out different rock types. So we can use it to we could use it for kind of targeted mining within a particular area, and the different characteristics that we see there. Those are the kind of things that we can use kind of in mining. We've got quite a lot of projects working on in Chile with mining, and so this is actually looking at kind of hybrid comms around a mine site, but you can kind of get to the idea of the type of imagery that you can use, and actually the different things that you can use it for. And some of the other things that we've used for mining are actually looking at the high resolution mapping. So if we're doing high resolution mapping, you actually start to look at extraction volume as well, so how much is actually being taken out of the ground at different times. And we also use these for planning as well. So in terms of if somebody's planning a new mine, and you need to move an awful lot of ore from one place to the next place, actually what's the most effective way of doing that, by doing this. And it enables us to do remote surveys. So if you want to monitor a mine from across the different side of the planet, then it's possible to do. And this is all derived from using satellite imagery, and then including the 3D models.
So are those pictures, that's satellite imagery?
That's satellite imagery. So we've used a satellite image, we've used what we call stereo pairs. So you use two different satellite images from different angles to create a 3D model, and then draped over it, the kind of the high resolution imagery. So you can get to kind of create this very accurate 3D model down to 50 centimetre kind of accuracy. So it's I'll say the resolution of the imagery is 50 centimetre and the resolution of the elevation model is 1 metre. But that's on a mine site, that's fairly good accuracy. And then if you kind of do that multiple times, then you can kind of calculate how much has been taken out of the ground. So satellites are also moving into a different age of now having CCTV in space, essentially. So you can see the different colours, you can see the plane going across, and you get the what we call the kind of parallax effect of the satellite moving across. The building's not actually moving, it's just as the satellite's moving across, it's the relative, it looks like the top's moving, but it's not. So I think it is, yes. It's somewhere out there. Yeah.
But you can't, then another satellite would have to kick in and carry on.
Yeah,
No, you couldn't have it
24/7. So the kind of the age of having video from space, it's relatively recent. So they've only been doing it for a couple of years. So it's still extremely expensive, and plus you're also getting kind of short bursts of data. So I think you can get about 30 seconds worth of data, and that's probably about £25,000 to £30,000. So it's still hugely expensive, but it's kind of showing a direction of travel as to actually what's going to be possible at some point in the future. And it's still relatively limited as to its resolution, so this is probably about the best you're going to get in terms of resolution. It's like I said, it's coming of age, and Google have kind of taken it on board now, and they've got their own company that are doing video from space, as well as a couple of other companies. So it's.
Did Google have their own satellites?
Google, they have a company that they've got their own satellites. Yeah, I don't think they're integrating them yet properly into the rest of kind of the Google world, if you like. They're kind of keeping a watching eye on it. And so they bought out another company that was, I think it was the company that was doing this, it was like Skybox Imaging or something, I think it was bought out by Google. One of the other areas that we look at is government services. So actually how can we provide different intelligence to governments as to what's actually going on. This isn't in terms of defence, this is actually kind of everyday life. How can we provide these different services? And something the UK government is very motivated to do. So I was talking about the Copernicus, European Commission kind of Copernicus system that we've put, as a country, we've put quite a lot of money into. So now they're trying to understand actually how they can use that data, better. So we're creating applications. For example, this was something we put together for Milton Keynes, and it's actually just helping them understand planning and kind of planning enforcement. So the challenge they have in Milton Keynes is that they've got 340 square kilometres of Milton Keynes. They've got to build 25,000 new homes over the next 5 years. They've only got 4 people in their planning department. So it becomes incredibly difficult for them to actually manage what is going on in their, in their kind of, if you like, always on the back foot in terms of their responding to things like somebody ringing up complaining that something's happening rather than actually being able to monitor. And certainly where you've got these large scale developments of big science parks or big retail parks that can be going on for 5-10 years in terms of their development, actually how do they know when to start putting in these different services? So we provided them with this kind of information that they get on a quarterly basis. It's just we built it into a web application so they can just have a quick glance and see actually what's changed in the last 3 months in Milton Keynes. And so they can start to they can then overlay that with different planning applications and understand who's doing stuff they shouldn't be doing, who's doing things that they they can be doing, and kind of how they how they build their 10-25 year plan. And this was one of the challenges that they had. They kind of had a 20-year plan, and I think with the financial crisis, they were finding that companies were buying plots of land and then not doing anything with them, kind of having it as a land bank. And so although they had their 25-year plan, they were finding that actually it wasn't being developed in the way that they had envisaged, and so this kind of provided them with just some information.
And in terms of this product that you do for multi-keys, do you have to visually inspect two images, or does it show?
No, it identifies. So yeah, so it's gone a bit squiffy on this, but so basically where we've got the blue polygons are the different planning applications, and then the orange is where we've actually identified change between two different images.
Yeah.
And these techniques for kind of identifying change are only really getting better.
Yeah.
They really are. So it's and now we can try to automate all these processes so that somebody just gets a delivery every. The challenge with Milton Keynes was actually trying to get a cloud-free day to take a nice image.
Yeah.
That was the biggest problem that we had. But these kind of techniques and these automations of these services are really kind of they're really kind of coming alive now, if you like, and it provides these different services. So what we also wanted to prove with Milton Keynes was actually if you pay to buy a satellite image, and about £10,000 for one satellite image of Milton Keynes, you don't just have to use that satellite image once. You can use it lots of different times for different services. So the more services you have off getting a single image, then the better value for money it is.
And is that how the commercial model works for the satellite operators? Do they sell by image, or could Milton Keynes say, just send me whatever photos you've got of Milton Keynes whenever they come up and pay?
Yeah, you can do it either way, really. So there's the satellite image industry. They're having to rethink their business models, really. So there's different ways you can purchase imagery. Most satellites will have what we call a background mission. So when they're not being tasked to do anything, they will just take pictures of different places that they think are important or could provide some information on something, and that's just called a background mission. And then when somebody's paying them to do something, they will task that particular image. So they have this big archive of imagery, some of which has been bought, some of which hasn't. But generally, when you buy imagery, you're only buying a license to use it. You're not actually buying the image itself.
Sure.
It is a changing market, certainly with the new satellite providers coming on who are looking at different ways of providing this data. Data providers are very protective over their data. They really worry about it getting out into the wild or people using it, and so there's an awful lot of copyrights around it and things like that. So yeah, we're kind of looking at different ways of kind of how we can use, how many times we can use it, and things like that. Sorry, did that answer the question?
Yeah, I was just yeah, I think it did.
Yeah.
Just saying both are possible.
Yeah, I think both are possible. There's just different mechanisms for doing
There's
that.
no one dominant commercial model.
No, not really. If I'm honest, I think the traditional industry hasn't done itself any favours.
Yeah.
Like I said, they're kind of almost overprotective over their data to the point where people don't buy it because they're so overprotective over it, which is almost doing themselves out of business. But with the new kids on the block, things are changing, and it's becoming slightly more flexible in terms of what you can do with the data, how you can use the data, and also there's a move to doing kind of cloud-based processing as well. So, for example, a US company called Digital Globe, who have a series of satellites, they've created a system where you don't actually take ownership, or you don't have physically have the data. You send a process, or you can create a process on their online system that will then run a process over the image and then just give you the answer out of it. And that's kind of the way that things are moving as well. So it's obviously these data they can be huge. They can be very large pieces of data, and actually shifting data from one place to another has a cost associated with it as well. So it's, there is kind of lots of thoughts around different models and how it can be done. This particular application was looking at what we call ecosystem services. So it's giving areas of land a particular score. In terms of its value to the environment, and it's actually giving it a a financial value as well. So what is the value on having fresh water? What is the value on having deciduous woodland over having brownfield site where a building's been knocked down? It provides a planning tool in terms of obviously when you look at Milton Keynes, there's quite a lot of concrete in the middle, which doesn't actually have a huge amount of benefit to the environment. But then down here you see there's a golf course, which isn't bad. And so it just helps as a planning tool in terms of building green corridors in different cities and things like that, and just kind of helping cities be more conscious of the environment. Natural resource management, another big application. This is Lake Mead, and it's basically looking at the different change over the period of time. And I was there last year, and it's very interesting, some of these areas where you've got like a boatyard that's now 3 miles away from the water.
Is that California?
It's yes, yeah. It's and that's kind of the change that's happened over just 15 years in terms of the water levels. And so it's this is again kind of where satellites, not a very commercial application, but it's just an environmental monitoring and awareness application in terms of what's going on. But again, this is just kind of an example of actual change detection and trying to automate some of those processes. So the next project I'll talk about is this is actually the biggest program that the Satellite Catapult's had, and it's developing a commercial access for small companies to provide services to governments and organisations around the world. So we started doing this 18 months ago. We're working in Malaysia with 23 different government agencies, and we kind of had three areas that we were asked to look at. One which is looking at the oil pollution in the Malacca Straits, looking at illegal logging and the environmental impact of that, and looking at flash flooding. And so this was about creating decision support tools that could run automatically on their own. They gather data, they process all the data, and they provide something that's usable by the end user who doesn't necessarily need to know anything about satellites. Flooding, obviously, it's a huge problem in a lot of areas in Malaysia, and they regularly have flooding in kind of between October and February, and every year. It's devastating. We're providing them with and we've just gone live with this about 2 weeks ago, providing them with live flood updates. So we give them 14-day flood warnings, which is just something that they haven't had. I think the best they've had is about 4 or 5 days. So we're providing them with different flood warnings, different hazard warnings. We're providing them with information about how to actually move populations around out of flood areas when the risk levels are high. And to kind of provide that as a service. And so this is kind of our, if you like, our first foray into kind of looking at these applications and actually running operational applications in this area. In addition to that, we've been looking at kind of the financial loss forecasting and the catastrophe mapping side of things, so that and these are services that could potentially be useful to insurance companies. They can be used to, and it's just kind of showing kind of particular risk areas, and also where the human risk is to those. Deforestation. It's a huge problem. Again, it's another huge problem in Malaysia. The challenge we've had with this is that actually there's so much corruption in the government that nobody actually wants to know where illegal deforestation is happening, because too many people are profiting from it. So it's become a real problem for us actually to try and embed this system in Malaysia, to the point that when we were over there kind of doing some site visits last year, 2 days after we left, the head of the forestry department got arrested for corruption. So it was it is a real challenge, but it's also a real problem that they have, and it's just devastating a lot of their environment. and oil pollution as well. So the Malacca Straits is is one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. I think it's second only to the English Channel. And they have a massive problem. They've got sensitive coastlines. They've got mangroves down here, but there's lots of ships are dumping oil or cleaning their bilges in that area, which is then creating oil slicks and then washing up. So what we've been doing is we've been created a system that uses satellite images to detect where there's oil on the surface of the water. We then model that to see where it's going to, and we also model it to see where it's come from, and then we correlate it with different AIS signals from the ships, so we can see actually who could be responsible for that particular oil slick. And so we can provide that information to the Malaysian authorities, and they can choose to do something about it if they want to. But it's again, this has gone live actually, and there was an oil slick last night, I think just down here somewhere. So we've been monitoring that quite closely this morning to see basically how good we are at saying where it's going to go.
So how, just in terms of that time frame, so you're very interested in this region, the Malacca Straits.
Yes.
So what frequency of image are you actually getting on that day?
So there's different ways we can do it. So we use the free imagery coming from Copernicus, so we can get an image every couple of days over that area, which just gives us a snapshot in time.
So that's free every couple
That's free every couple of days, and that just kind of gives us this kind of background monitoring scenario, if you like. And we use a variety of different methods for modelling that. So we use all the tidal data, we use all the weather data, we use surface roughness, surface temperature, and all of that data is derived from, well, except for the kind of the tide times, the rest of it's derived from satellites.
But, so you have Copernicus that gives you a free
Yes, we get
every 3 days.
Yeah.
And then do you get more images in between?
Yeah, so certainly if somebody's identified something, so it could be a ship has radioed in saying we've spotted an oil slick, or it could be some coastal patrol vessel, or it could be that we detect something on our satellites. We then task commercially available satellites so we can get regular updates on every day, or at least every day. Yeah, so we make a call and say we need some satellite imagery there. So kind of the system runs in the background using the free data, so that we're not essentially just racking up a huge bill when there's an awful lot of ocean out there, and there's a lot of sea out there, and if we just collect a lot of images of sea, then we might not.
And who's able to get free data?
So anybody can get it. It's freely available.
So when you say it's every 3 days, is that for most places in the world, or is that just?
No, it's for most places. Most places. It varies a little bit. So it can vary between 3, probably up to 10 days, depending on where you are, and it just depends in kind of what point of the orbit that in the cycle, in the duty cycle, that you want an image.
And what resolution is it?
So it's 10-meter resolution. So
what is
good.
Is it just a website you go onto and you?
Yeah, absolutely. So
get the coordinates of where you want to go. Or?
Yeah, and then you can download the imagery from there. So it's a little bit hostile in so much as the imagery that is there at the minute is kind of what we call the raw imagery, so it's not processed. The optical imagery, yes, you can see what you're getting, and the radar imagery is a little bit more complex. I mean, you can still see what you're getting, but if you want to detect something like oil, then we need to do some processing techniques on there. Yeah, yes, yeah, exactly. So you can see things like that. So yeah, it's
one of the interests, particularly in that part of the world for us, of course, is the movement of goods
vessels.
And services.
Yes,
through there,
yeah.
Especially in an old-fashioned way. We used to stop off in Singapore, and you take a look out and look at how many ships were lying in the Malacca Straits, and how many of them were high or low waterline, to see if they were laden or unladen.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So just to give us a sort of rough guess, I would have thought it would be able to do that fairly easily.
Yeah, I would think there's different techniques we can use for kind of looking at how high a vessel is in the water, or how high something is.
Sorry, what is the website then?
So we've got our own system for this. So it's called CDAS. So SEDAS. And if you went to the Catapult website, we've basically set up our own system in the UK for making data available to the UK. So it's freely available from there. I can send a link around, and we can all have a look. And if you're actually interested in something particular, then let us know, and we can.
Grass then.
In terms of interrogating that data then, obviously we can go on and we can look at a picture.
Yeah.
But what is it that you guys are looking at? Like reflectivity, the strength?
Yeah, it could be backscatter, it could be...
Yeah.
So the way that we detect oil is that it's actually we use a proxy, so where oil affects the water by actually making it smooth relatively compared to the water around it. So we look for smooth areas of water, and that's how we...
And that's by the height of the surface?
Basically, it could be the height, it's just the roughness. It's like, it's a
But in terms of the data, how are you determining roughness? What is it in there that's...
It is what we call the backscatter signal. So so we do some processing on that backscatter, and we get an image, and you can see from the image where is smooth, where is rough. Yeah. And I mean, we do pick up other things other than oil, because there are other things that affect surface. So it could be like an algae bloom or something like that. So we're using machine learning techniques to actually identify what the shape of an algae bloom is compared to what the shape of an oil slick is. So we did some work in the South China Sea looking at some leaking pipelines, and because you always get a point of origin for a leak, you kind of get this spider effect of where the oil's coming from. So if you've always got something in the same place with detecting things around it, then actually you can say, well, it's some infrastructure that's creating a particular problem, or it could be a natural seep. But yeah.
And going back to the Milton Keynes example there, again, when you're interrogating the raw data, are you just looking for polygons, and that's how it picks out where a building is?
We use different classification techniques. It basically looks at the pixels around it, and says, is it similar, is it not similar? Yeah. And so you can kind of then create a load of polygons essentially of kind of similar shaped or coloured things, and you can refine that to actually get it pretty accurate at actually determining what a building is or what a car is, or because you can then look at the shape of that polygon and say, well, if it's roughly about 3 meters long and about 2 meters wide, it's probably a car, or something along those lines. And we've even, using some optical data, we've even looked at actually how you can determine the speed of a car, because the way that the satellite collects data, and if it's collecting 3 bands, for example, it's collecting red, green, blue, there is a split second in between it collecting those bands of light, so you can then calculate the difference between the green band and the red band, and what the speed is based on how far it's moved in that time. So there's lots of different kind of techniques that we use depending on what the particular application is. But yeah, it's the techniques kind of are advancing now, and certainly kind of with using machine learning and AI techniques, we're starting to, you can do some manual classifications and say, okay, so this is a building, that's a car, that's a car, that's a car, and then you kind of feed it in, and as it gathers more information about how many cars it's spotting, and it can determine what the characteristics of a car are, then actually the next image you put in, it would just say, oh, those are all the cars, and those are all the buildings, and those are all the trees. So
is that all bespoke stuff, or are there very commoditized software?
There's a mixture. So there's a lot of software, off-the-shelf software now, from a variety of different companies that are doing that actually quite well. And then there's kind of the more researchy side, or the more kind of, we're also looking at kind of some of the open source software that's available, and so we're working with a couple of universities to develop open source software that's then available to the market for people to use to do different things like this. So it's a really interesting market, and it is kind of, I think, given that we've now got a huge amount more data coming into it, there's a lot more innovation happening around it. So it's all.
Are there any? So, I guess the resolution you need to be able to detect something 2 meters by 3 meters is probably less than a meter.
Yeah, so you're probably a 50 centimeter resolution image would get you the.
Are there any free 50 centimeter resolutions?
No, unfortunately, they're not yet. Not yet. But I mean, I think a few years, I think there will be.
Yeah. What did you say the resolution was currently available for free? 10
for free data is 10 meters.
So from space, what's a clarity would we get on a 10 metre?
A 10 metre.
Just one car or?
Probably not so much a car. And a building will be relatively, depending on how big the building is, it'll be fairly relatively pixelated. But I mean, because those satellites are really designed for environmental monitoring, you're kind of looking at huge areas of, kind of country scale kind of monitoring, and that's kind of information that they provide. So it's a bit of horses for courses, really. It depends what you want to do. If you want to look at a country, then there's no point having 50 centimetre resolution data, because you'll spend a huge amount of money, and actually you'll just have a massive amount of data that is then really difficult to work with. So it just depends what you want to do with it.
And what's the resolution of the Sentinel?
Sentinel is 10 metres.
10 metres. Right.
10 metres. So that goes for the radar and so there's two of each at the minute. There's Sentinel 1A and 1B, which are the radar satellites, and then there's Sentinel 2A and 2B, which are the optical satellites. So that's.
So with Google Earth, the resolution there is actually very high.
It is when you zoom in, but when you zoom in, you're actually looking at aerial photography for the majority of it. So when you're using Google Earth, when you're zoomed out, it's satellite imagery, and then as you zoom into it, it blends into actually using aerial photography. And I mean, something like Google Earth is getting a lot better, but they have been like 4 years out of. So some of the images are actually quite old, so they're not necessarily the concurrency isn't quite there, or the currency isn't quite there. So. Something happened now. So ESOS at the minute, we're running those 3 services in Malaysia, and we're running them operationally, but we're also looking at future opportunities as well. So we're potentially doing something down in Chile with mining. We're looking at transport. We're looking at different areas, energy, utilities, and basically we're using it as a vehicle. So the consortium for ESOS, I think we had 14 different small companies from the UK, but we had a single brand, so that rather than going out to a country and saying, oh well, we've got a whole load of different companies that could do some different stuff for you, we kind of decided to have a unified brand, so we can bring all these companies through, and then we sell as ESOS. And so it's kind of it's a business unit now within the Catapult, and will probably spin out at some point in the future. So kind of move on to some of the emerging technologies. So I won't dwell a huge amount on these, but kind of 2015 to 2020, so it's already a couple of years out of date. This, so looking at mega constellations, so basically more satellites. So some of this has got kind of the comm stuff in as well, but it's
On the topic of when someone chooses to put a satellite up for whatever reason, commercial or is there a particular agreement that they need to get in order to be able to put a satellite up? Because of course we hear that there is such a cluttered airspace.
Yeah, so there's now quite strict policies and they now have to, all satellites now have to have what we call a deorbiting capability. So either they bring them down and burn up in the atmosphere, or they send them off into space. But it's.
And I suppose that would also go depending on the sensitivity of where you're going to cross. I'm sure the Chinese wouldn't like to see a load of US satellites tearing overhead, and vice versa. We wouldn't particularly like that.
Yeah, I mean they do that. I mean, all of these satellites are. It's like kind of we said at the beginning. All these satellites can pretty much take an image of anywhere on the planet. Pretty much. There's a few restrictions. It generally depends on where the satellite is, or what country owns the satellite.
If they're taking sensitive pictures, let's just say over air bases anywhere in the world, that I wouldn't have thought they would particularly want that imagery to be generally accessed.
They can't necessarily stop them. So the US providers will take images of all places in all over the world, and basically the Chinese will do the same. So if you want a picture of a sensitive place in the US, like a military base, if you went to a Chinese operator, you'd probably be able to buy that image. And the same vice versa. And it's amazing how little regulation is actually around where you can take an image, because it is just dependent on the provider. So you know, in the UK, we've got a number of satellites, and they'll be places in the UK that they won't let you buy a satellite image if you go to that provider. But then if you go to the US one, you can just buy it. And you know, we've had a few surprising conversations with so nuclear power stations, for example. We did some work with one in the.
So you're saying a company that may not in the UK allow you to access their data because it might be, but if you went to a US or a French or a German or a Chinese provider, they might just say, "Here you go."
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So it's
Shop around.
absolutely there probably isn't a very good way. There isn't really a way of managing it. It's there are blacklisted countries where.
You mean that the information won't be sold to them?
Yes. Yeah. But then again, it depends on who the satellite provider is. Yeah, if you go to a US provider, then you won't be able to do it, or you can get a middleman, or you know, there's different ways of getting hold of this data. There's surprisingly little regulation around it, to be honest.
Okay.
So these are just some of the things happening in the next, I suppose, 2 or 3 years. You know, near real-time EO services, we are starting to get there with that. You know, you can take a satellite image, and I think we've got it down to about 45 minutes. You can then have that image on a screen on your desk. So it's and you have to pay quite a lot for that kind of near real-time application, but as with all commercial companies, they will bump up the price the more the quicker you want it. But there are ways of getting it.
Was the technology around when that plane, the Malaysian aeroplane, crashed off Australia? You would have thought that they would have been able to lock in sufficient enough satellites to see debris on the.
Yeah, so there was a lot of work done around that. So actually, the company that managed to pinpoint where they thought the plane had gone down was actually a UK company that dealt in satellite communications, and they had managed to triangulate where they thought they had picked up different signals and identify roughly where they thought it was. But actually, at the time, the Malaysian government wasn't actually listening to them. So although they were providing information, there wasn't much going on there. And so there was a lot of satellite images tasked to see if they could identify where that was, and there's something called the International Disaster Charter. So if something happens somewhere in the world, countries that are signed up to that can kind of invoke this charter. And an awful lot of satellite data providers are signed up to it as well, and they will then kind of pull the full weight of all the satellites to try and take images of something. So if there's an earthquake somewhere, if a volcano goes up somewhere, you can invoke the charter, which will then give you days of satellite imagery, as often as you can get satellite imagery. So there was a lot of work done by a company called Tomnod around the Malaysian airline that went down, and so they were using crowdsourcing techniques. So although you could take as many thousands of images over the ocean is a very big place, so trying to actually identify where something's going on, so they put all these images out on the web and just crowdsourced people just looking at the images and saying, yes, there's something in that, no, there's nothing in that, and so that was how they kind of got around that. But I think it turned out in the end they were all looking in the wrong place. I think it's probably what happened. So I'll move on. So 2020 to 2025, so we're starting to look at new material science, self-organizing networks, AI and neural processing technology. So this is something that's obviously new material science. That's very good for spacecraft. If you can make strong, low weight satellites, then that's only going to be a good thing. Self-organizing networks is kind of that's more looking at kind of the mobile networks and 6G. AI though is becoming very applicable to EO satellites, and so doing some work with IBM around their neurosynaptic chips. And the reason we're very interested in this is because EO data is very large. Moving it around is actually very costly in terms of energy. So trying to get a load of data down off a satellite actually it costs a lot in terms of the energy, the batteries that are used to try and get it, and the communication of that data. So by having processing on board of the satellites, so if you're looking for a particular answer to a question, rather than it shipping the data down, if it just tells you this is happening there, then it's the answers are it's a lot lower cost in terms of moving the data, because it's just giving you the information you need. And so we're looking quite strongly into that and kind of having these kind of onboard processing techniques and AI. So now we're looking kind of 2025, 2030. So hybridization, robotics, again new material science, satellites, and high altitude platforms. So that's quite interesting. So we call these stratolytes. So they're not quite satellites, they're not quite in space, but they're above the weather in the atmosphere, and they just sit there kind of doing persistent monitoring over a particular place. And the benefit is that you're not trying to deal with a satellite that has to keep moving around the Earth to stay in space. You can actually just have it planted over a particular city or a particular area, and do monitoring in that way. So using the same sort of Earth observation techniques, but instead the platform is just in a slightly lower altitude. And then kind of the fractionated and cooperative constellation. So this is using multiple satellites, but in kind of in what do we call it? We call it in concert with one another. So actually, rather than having one satellite and then you've got another satellite, actually, if you could have all the satellites working together, then actually you would never have to. You would be able to look at every place all at the same time.
How would a stratolite stay where it is? Does it have to power against an orbit?
So the ones they use at the minute are actually they're a bit like gliders. They just massive winged, low energy, solar powered, and they just fly at a very, very high altitude. And because they're above the weather, they don't have to. They are quite fragile, but they don't have to deal with being buffeted around by the weather. So. And also, yeah.
Could those be used as a bridge between the satellites and to bring the costs to getting the data down?
They could, but actually we're kind of looking at different things for doing that. So we're using what we call relay satellites. So the one was launched last year by European Space Agency, and basically what we do is we have a communication satellite that sits out in geostationary orbit, and so rather than a satellite having to wait until it goes over a ground station to get the data down, it basically has a laser comms to a geostationary satellite, so it can always see the ground station, because that's the other problem with satellites, is that if you're not over somewhere to download the data, you can't get it off and you've only got a limited basically hard drive on your satellite, so if it fills up, it fills up, so you have to wait until you get over somewhere to download it. But having something like a geostationary satellite, you can use kind of more lower cost in terms of energy techniques of getting the data between that, and then that geostationary satellite has always got visibility of a ground station and can get the data down that way. And at some point in the future, we've always been thinking about data centers in space. So there's a lot lower cost in terms of cooling in space. So there's
undersea.
Yeah. So this is another quick video that will just talk about our vision for the next 15 years.
How's life in the Arctic today?
It's busy. 14 cargo ships in the China path in the last 3 days. Lots more fishing boats too. We can see the cod stocks are up.
How's the new strain of oil eaters getting along?
Alcatavorax 17 is the one. Satellite shows good growth rates and we're getting on top of the league. So I'll be home next week.
At last. That's great news.
I know. I'm actually starting to dream about bacon sandwiches. Can you make sure that there's some nice food in the fridge when I get back?
Done. The fridge is talking to the supermarket right now.
Oh, what time are you leaving for Bristol?
Oh, 5 minutes.
Okay. Good luck. And don't forget Jack's present.
Hello, Tom. Please state your intended destination.
Hotel du Vin, Bristol.
Estimated arrival time, 10:21 a.m.
Good morning, Hotel du Vin.
Hi, I'm coming down for dinner tonight. Is it going to rain at 8 o'clock?
It's looking rather lovely all evening, sir.
Perfect. In that case, we'll eat outside.
Certainly, sir.
Call Aziza. Hi, Aziza. I'm on my way to Bristol now. Looking forward to seeing the presentation later. I hope you can join us for the contract signing afterwards.
Good morning, Dr. Jones. What can we do for you today?
Hi. That book I bought last week. Can you send another one to me this morning? It's rather urgent.
Shall we send it to your current location, Hotel du Vin?
That would be great.
Of course. We have one available. They'll be with you in 40 minutes.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Personalized medicine production is a major industry here. But what you see now is our new MRSA antiviral crops. This used to be degraded land, polluted by mining works decades ago. But we mapped the worst areas and reclaimed the rest. Now it is a very productive site. Each host plant is tagged and talks to us, of course. So we know how well it's growing, what it needs, and when to harvest it. Our production is up 34% from last year already. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to me.
Okay, darling, but hey, look at your blood sugar levels. You need to eat first, okay? 50 grams of carbs. Go.
Call car.
Do you wish to amend location?
Come to the hotel immediately.
Dr. Jones.
Hi, Tina. I've just had the alert about Mr. McKendrick on the solar power orbiter. I don't want to wait any longer. Send the stent design files to their med bay and ask the team to prep for an implant now, please.
Certainly, Doctor.
I'll screen in from the car. This is Dr. Jones requesting screening to the medical bay solar orbiter.
Thank you. You are joining the theatre now. Data will follow.
Good afternoon, Dr. Scott. The patient signs are good, so please feel free to proceed when ready.
Well, guys, we are all signed.
Next stop, the brave new world. Speaking of which, did you remember, Tom?
Of course. Something for your collection.
Thank you. I love it. Look at this. Personal hovercars. So when's all this futuristic stuff going to arrive then? I can't wait.
So there we go. That's just a bit of a view of our vision of the next few years. Sorry, it was a bit jumpy, but that pretty much wraps up. But I just wanted to show you this. So this is my favourite satellite image. So this was taken by Worldview 3, 32 centimetres resolution, and it was taken as Mount Kilimanjaro was just coming over the horizon. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.